Today I wanted to make just a brief point, combining a few different sources in Tanakh, thinking about the topic of love and marriage. And this obviously can be a very lengthy topic. We'll try to make this a brief point today, but I think in short, it is interesting to note that the Torah's understanding of ahava, which we translate as love, and its relationship to marriages between men and women is not necessarily the same either as we would get from, I don't know, more sort of classical Western sources, like as it's come down from Greek mythology and through, medieval literature or whatever, or to the more sort of updated present day, or let's say 20th century Hollywood notion of the relationship between what people call love and marriage in the West. And it is worth thinking through a little bit what those differences are, partly because it has practical implications in Avodat Hashem for thinking about, what a marriage is and what the role of ahava is, or what the role of love is, and are those the same thing, in fact. And also because, it's a theme that actually runs through a lot of different pieces of Tanakh and connects different elements, actually seemingly specifically in the generations preceding and leading up to and through the life of David. It seems to be a theme. You look at it with Tamar and Yehuda and with Ruth and Boaz, but then it comes down to David, and there's all these different things that involve men and women in the story of David and his family. But I think I'll start with just a simple basic point, which is, I believe it's the case, although I'm very interested to know if there's a counterexample to this. It's hard to make declarations about Tanakh and be 100% sure you haven't just missed a minor mention of something. I believe it's the case that there is only one woman in Tanakh who is described as loving her husband, or who is described in relation to her husband using the verb ahava, or the shoresh of ahava, and that is Michal, the first wife of David. It says in Sefer Shmuel Aleph, "Vayar Shaul vayada'a ki Adonai im David, uMichal bat Shaul ahavatu." And Shaul saw and knew that Hashem was with David, and that Michal, Shaul's daughter, loved him. So, ahavat hu is the word that's used for Michal. And we have a lot of other examples of marriages in Tanakh, and we have a lot of other examples of seemingly successful marriages, or marriages that had love in them even, or mention of ahava in them. But maybe we don't notice, maybe we do notice this. It generally tends to run in the other direction. We are told, for example, that Yitzhak loved Rivka, or the verb ahava is used in that direction, from Yitzhak to Rivka. We are told the same about Yaakov and Rachel, right? That Yaakov feels ahava for Rachel. And we could list various other examples of other relationships in Tanakh that involve ahava in some way. And I mean, another thing that's important to say is just when you back away, ahava is not the same way, to be fair, as it is in English. It's not just about relationships between men and women. It's not just about relationships that in some way involve perhaps sexuality or things of that nature. It really, the fundamental idea of ahava is about, if you read it just from the context in which it appears, it's about preference and inclination and a desire to be with, or to provide for, or to bestow gifts upon another person, or to kind of possess them, or add them to your close circle, right? And so that could be all sorts of things, like we're told, using again the verbs of ahava. And I'm going through sources very rapidly, so I'm not going to jump around and read all of them. But that Yitzhak had ahava for Esav, and or at least that Rivka had ahava for Yaakov. But that there's ahava is used in the context of contrasting Yitzhak and Rivka in their relationship to Esav on the one hand and Yaakov on the other. And we also have mention of ahava in more troubling contexts. For example, when Amnon, the son of David, desires to rape and then eventually does rape his half-sister Tamar, who is the daughter of David, ahava is again used there to describe how he felt, because it says then after he rapes her that just as he had felt ahava for her, now he feels sinah, hatred. And so I think that example in particular really underlines for you that ahava has a narrow set of criteria, or actually, maybe the word is actually a broad range. The way I would put it is the criteria for feeling ahava embraces a broad range of circumstances, and it should not be thought of as something that only happens in the context of virtue, or only happens in the context of appropriate relationships. It can be about a sort of unfair preference. It can be about a forbidden attraction. And all of those things kind of fit under this big umbrella, because again, it's a very almost simple and capacious category, saying it's any instance where someone wants to do things for someone else and prefers that, the object of that affection or that preference. And so it can be something that exists in a relationship, like a marriage, or it can be something that exists in a very different context. And perhaps the best example of this is that we're commanded. It says, "V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol me'odecha." So we're commanded to love Hashem, but then we need this explication from Mefarshim of what does it mean to feel ahava for Hashem. And some commentators will say, well, what that means is you should do mitzvot, because the way you show ahava for Hashem is you do for Him that which He hopes you will do for Him. And, it's like a gift that you're bestowing upon Him out of a longing for or preference for Akadosh Baruch Hu, a desire to have a greater closeness. And that's, the way that's accomplished is through mitzvot. So all of this is context for this discussion. But I think the point is we have to contrast this with how ahava is often portrayed. If you think about the sort of late 20th century Hollywood movie kind of idea of love and its relationship to marriage, it's an idea of love that comes from various streams in the West, comes from first of all, the Hellenistic idea of love as a deified sort of longing, which then gets filtered through Christianity and turned into this longing that is somehow very pure and can't be sort of fulfilled through proper behavior. And so, when you get to the medieval period, it's like Lancelot and Guinevere, right? And Lancelot is not married to Guinevere. Guinevere is married to King Arthur, but Lancelot and Guinevere are in love with each other, but they can't pursue or fulfill that love. And so it's this very sort of chaste or pure longing that just is about adoration from afar, which kind of comes in line with this Christian ideal of suffering. And in this life, you just have to kind of suffer and deify love, and then things happen later in some spiritual realm. So that all gets kind of swirled together by the time you get to the 20th century. And Hollywood makes it into this other thing, which is that you get to be Lancelot and Guinevere, except that is how you get to feel about the person that you marry. and that the point of marriage is to feel that kind of perfect, selfless devotion and adoration, and to get to sign on the dotted line, so to speak, and then have a bond that forms between two people who are supposed to feel that kind of feeling for each other, and then that's the basis for this thing that they do, which is getting married. And one has to tread very carefully here, because I certainly believe, and I think many people would say from their experience, and Baruch Hashem, I can also say from my experience, that love is a very important part of marriage and can be a great thing. But I do think it is interesting still to ask what Tanakh is showing us marriage is when you get down to the bare bones, because there's all these things that marriage can become when you let it kind of germinate and develop, and the social context in which it happens kind of ages and changes, and society becomes more complex and all these things. But if we go to what marriage is fundamentally in the eyes of Tanakh, I would not say that it is clear cut that a fundamental ingredient of marriage, or even what you would call a successful marriage, is this thing called ahava. It's something that can exist, and sometimes it can be, at least as far as what Tanakh mentions, one way. But it is not necessarily a fundamental requirement, and it may even be kind of a distraction from the fundamentals as far as Tanakh is concerned, and it's worth pondering that a little bit. So why would I say what I'm saying here? I think if you look over many examples, you could talk about Avraham and Sarah, you could talk about Tamar and Yehuda, and we're going to talk about David and Michal in a second. I think what you can say about the theme that runs through many or all of these is that there are other things that you start to notice about what marriage is meant to fundamentally consist of when you go to this near state of nature, ancient world situation, where there are a lot of things that exist in the present day that are actually very relatively recent developments, that when you strip them away, you get closer to the unchangeable facts of the human condition and things about relationships between men and women that are going to exist in that state, and that the Torah is really addressing itself to, because it's trying to talk to these kind of most immovable signposts in the human condition. And one of these things is it's about children. It's about producing children, that men and women produce children together. And there's a question of when and how that's going to happen and under what kind of an arrangement. And then there's also the fact that people have different kinds of desires for each other, and being together carnally, like we see in Gan Eden, obviously that is a factor that produces children. But the question is, what is the aim of marriage when people get married in view of Tanakh? And I think you can argue that the focus is on the production of children rather than on the somehow the fulfillment of some emotional desire of husband and wife. That the fundamental fact of the situation is that there needs to be some kind of contractual agreement between parties where everyone is happy with some kind of promise that they're each making to each other. And that has to be motivated in a way that this can be something that the Torah will want to sanctify and will want to upraise and say, this is the goal, or this is the ideal. And what makes that challenging, as far as Tanakh always is concerned, it would seem, is that there's this constant slippery slope to different kinds of snoot, right? Different kinds of prostitution. That one of the kinds of dynamics that can exist between men and women is one in which it's a transaction that is about the fulfillment, let's say, of carnal desire on the part of the man, and the receipt of some kind of goods in exchange that the woman might seek. And that's not the only thing, obviously, that can happen, but it is something that through human history, and as if we're talking about the basic, again, bare bones of the human condition, the more you go into a condition where it's a very dangerous world, and it is a much less wealthy world, it's a much less technologically sophisticated world, and also a world with, let's say, a much more meager tissue of accumulated understanding of morality inspired by biblical ideas and all of this stuff, the sort of topsoil that we're living on after a very long time of ideas from Tanakh, percolating through the practices of humanity in general. It's a way for people to relate to each other that is not so hard to get the idea in someone's head that different people have things to offer and things that they want, and they can strike some kind of bargain. And you see that in specific examples in Tanakh. For example, the interesting thing in the case of Tamar and Yehuda, what's I think so fascinating about the example of Tamar and Yehuda is that it's actually trying to show you something about what Tanakh wants to idealize in marriage and say, this is not prostitution. Like, marriage is the one thing you can do that is not prostitution. But what makes it so? But it uses a story that is on the surface about prostitution. Because what's the story of Tamar and Yehuda? Tamar is Yehuda's daughter-in-law. She marries his older son, he dies. So then his younger son, Onan, marries her. Then he also dies. And then there's this third son, Shelah. And initially, Yehuda kind of withholds Shelah because he's a little nervous. He doesn't want Shelah to die. He's not sure what's going on there. But Tamar, as a result, is in this permanent state of widowhood and is, as a result, being prevented from having children. And what she wants is to have children. But in order to do that, she has to kind of, be tricky. And so she follows Yehuda to a place where he's going to go, where they're shearing sheep, and she dresses up, in disguise, and he mistakes her for a prostitute. And they transact, and afterwards she's carrying his child. And then the fact that she's carrying his child and also has signs from him that he presented to her, as a promise that he would give her a goat, which was supposed to be the wealth that was being transacted in this, pageant, or let's say this acting out of a seemingly more seamy act of prostitution. He gives her his thread and his seal and his staff, and she presents them back to him. And then the fact that she's carrying his child, she's not punished in the way that people thought she had to be for having become pregnant through prostitution. And the way that this piece of narrative operates, if you think of it in terms of, okay, a man goes to a woman, and rather than actually just paying her, he gives her signs of his commitment to provide her with support, right? He gives her a staff and a thread and a seal. He's giving her tokens, things that have symbolic value, and they symbolize a larger commitment to provide financial support. And then she becomes pregnant by him, and her desire in that transaction was not to get a goat, which was what she's promised, but rather to bear children. And she ends up getting what she wants, which is that she's going to have a child, and also she got the promise of support. That outcome, in a sense, is a model for how marriage actually works in halakha, right? What marriage is in halakha is you have, the criteria for marriage are, shtar, kesef, and yichud, right? You have to have like a contract stating the terms of what's being provided by the husband, and there's some kind of wealth that's being promised, like a ring, that's worth a certain amount. and then they have to be alone together and be intimate. And so you have the elements of halachic marriage here, and even the suggestion that there's kind of this substitution of the simple transaction that would happen in an act of prostitution for, symbols of a promise of support. And I think the key thing is that the focus is on the fact that the woman is doing this not because she wants the wealth or the support, but that she wants the child. And that as a result of the fact that she's carrying the child, she deserves support and needs support. And that's what changes the dynamic, I think. And that dynamic is something that you see all over Tanakh, these different versions, because there both are many discussions of marriages that produce children or are based on the desire to have children in Tanakh. And there are also many examples of different kinds of prostitution that are talked about, especially when you get into the poetry of the Nevi'im. And so you get to see, many versions of both. And I think that maybe the fundamental idea is that Tanakh says what makes a real marriage worth something and something that can be sanctified and something that can be different is that it's about promises. It is in a sense a business relationship, but it's a different kind of business relationship than one of prostitution, because one of prostitution focuses on the carnal desire of one party and the ability of the other party to satisfy that desire, and the desire for material wealth on the part of one party and the ability of the other party to provide that material wealth or protection and wealth, let's say. And what shifts instead is that now we're talking about the desire on the part of one party or both to have a child, and the need for that child to be brought in the world in a context that ensures material support for the family that's going to come into being, and also that ensures a faithfulness on the part of the mother of the child, so that, essentially the husband can know that the children will be his, and that that provides the basis for all this commitment of material support and security that are then owed as a result. And so, I want to talk about just a few more sources that kind of triangulate this issue, because we now have to get at the question of, like, where is love supposed to fit in there? Like, is love an important thing in marriage or not? Because in what we just described, it sounds like something that could in principle not require either love in the Hollywood sense or ahava in the biblical sense. It could just be, well, you want to create children, this is how you do that. And it's sensible to construct a kind of a compact between people who are going to do this together, so that they can fulfill roles that will make the whole enterprise successful. But do they need to feel anything about each other, or do they just kind of work together and play their part and make a successful next generation together, and in the way that is possible to do that? And yes, it's preferable to children born out of wedlock to prostitutes after they have committed enough acts of prostitution that they end up bearing children, because then it disambiguates the paternity and creates a situation where men have more incentive to take care of their own children because they know who their own children are. So it kind of it solves that problem. But is there any necessity for there to be what we think of as what we now in the present day call romantic love, or Tanachic ahava, if we think of that as something different or not totally parallel and not totally perpendicular to the Hollywood romantic love or some other version like that? So there are two more sources that I think we can just comment on briefly here. One is this one with Michal and David, because I think it's the case, as I think I already said, that Michal may be the only woman in Tanakh who's described as loving her husband. And I guess the question we have to ask is, why did she love her husband? And what is that? What else does the text have to tell us about the nature of that relationship if it was so special? because I think to some degree, well, part of what I'll be wanting to argue is that Tanakh is not saying women can never love their husbands, but it is kind of squinting at this and saying, well, this is actually something of a rare circumstance. It seems men can have all sorts of different kinds of ahava for women, including totally forbidden and repulsive sorts like Amnon and Tamar. Notice, the connection, Tamar and Tamar. But Amnon having ahava for his sister, that doesn't make ahava sound like a very pure and virtuous thing. And so it sounds more perhaps like lust, but it isn't quite lust. It isn't always lust. But then what does it mean that Michal has this ahava for David? So later on, after David and Michal have been married, but then David has been, in this civil war with Shaul, her father, that he's now been successful basically in winning, and they're bringing the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant, into the city. It says, "V'haya Aron Adonai ba'ir David, u'Michal bat Shaul nishkefa be'ad Halon, v'ter'eh et hamelech David mipazez u'mecharker lifnei Adonai, v'tivez lo b'libah." So as the ark of the Lord came into the city, Michal, Shaul's daughter, looked through the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And then this exchange goes on between them, where basically, she's the princess, she's the daughter of the king already, and she sees David behaving in this very populist way, where he's just dancing with the people in the street, and she's repulsed by his lack of regal separation from the people. And she makes a comment to him about that, and he rebukes her and replies curtly, and we won't read through all of it. But this whole episode where they have this exchange, the way it ends is, David says, "Unikaloti od mizot v'hayiti shafal ba'inai va'im ha'amahot asher amart imam ikaveda." And I will make myself more contemptible than this, and will be abased in my sight. And of the maidservants which you have spoken of them shall I be held in honor. So he's, doubling down on the populism and saying, look, if he's going to be the king of Am Hashem, all of these people are Am Hashem, and he's not going to be an aristocrat. He's going to be a, warrior, a happy warrior fighting for the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he doesn't need to be high class in order to do that. And Michal says, and so that's the end of their exchange. And the last pasuk is, "Ulemichal bat Shaul lo hayala yeled ad yom mota." And Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had no child to the day of her death, which is a very stinging rebuke from the standpoint of Tanakh, because so much of Tanakh focuses on all these women who desire deeply to have children, and it's very difficult for them, and they're praying and they're hoping. I mean, you can list off the top of your head. There's Sarah, there's actually Rivka. It doesn't dwell on that, but she was also having difficulties. It says there's Rachel, or you could say Rachel and Leah, because they both in their way are very concerned with this. There's Hannah. There's the mother of Shimshon, the wife of Elkanah, and it just goes on and on and on. This is one of the most robust themes in Tanakh. And the one woman who is described as loving her husband, I think, maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the one woman in all of Tanakh who's described as having ahava for her husband. It explicitly says, and she never had a child, right? Where we're led to expect that you can be 90 years old or something, and still, the gates haven't closed, and maybe you'll have a child, like Sarai Menu did, and that this is something that a woman may desire her whole life and have to wait a long time for, and miracles can happen. And here's suddenly the doors just slammed shut brutally, at this moment where Michal is having this exchange with David, and I think it goes back to in the end, why did she have her ahava for David? What does that mean? What does it mean that she loved David? And one thing you could just ask is, is this telling us a little bit? Okay, maybe a woman can love her husband, but once she has children, then of course she still can love her husband, but she's going to love her children a lot. And that, in a sense, for the text to emphasize that Michal can love David, it's kind of required that she also not have children, or else maybe that's the reason all these other women in Tanakh are not described as loving their husbands, because there's so much focus on the children they would eventually have and the whole idea of who they became and what they were. And so that's maybe a lighter way of reading this. But, I think something that focuses more on a condemnation of Michal, because in a sense this is a condemnation, it's saying the ahava that she felt for David, now we realize through this passage what was really about her admiration for him as a potential king, right? And she, in her own way, as a king's daughter, regarded David as noble and as someone who had potential as a royal figure. And when she sees him kind of taking that potential and cheapening it, that upsets her. And at that moment, we're told also, and she had no children, because there was something kind of upside down, seemingly from the standpoint of Tanakh, perhaps, in the nature of her relationship, where she did have this ahava for her husband, but maybe what Tanakh wants from some ideal relationship is not for a woman to just be besotted with a man that she has some obsessed admiration for as an individual, where what she cares about is his career, or what she cares about is his honor, or and that those are the things in him that she most admires, because what matters more is what they can create together. And once they're busy creating that, if we're talking about where someone's preferences go and where someone's devotion goes, perhaps the natural dynamic of a successful family, with a marriage between a man and a woman, is where it's not about the woman's continued, let's say, infatuation with her husband, even if obviously still there are lots of things that happen that we associate with love, we associate with affection, and maybe they can be important for helping things to work. If we're talking about the bones, the foundation of how all of this is seen through Tanakh, the thing that is being emphasized is the children. And if the children are absent, maybe that somehow correlates in the view of Tanakh with the dynamic of the relationship between the man and the woman, kind of looking more romantic or something, looking more kind of like the Hollywood ideal, which is about the couple and what happens between them, as opposed to being about what they create together. The last source that I want to mention and present, that maybe triangulates these 2 points, and I'll just mention it in brief, is Moshe and Tzipporah, because I think that there what you may see is another point on the board, kind of in the opposite direction, where we're saying, okay, Moshe and Tzipporah get married, and Tzipporah is from Midian. She's not from within the tribe, and she's sort of becoming part of the tribe of Moshe by marrying him. And there's this question of what is the nature of their relationship and what's going to be the nature of the family that they create together. And there's this episode where they're on the way to Mitzrayim, and someone, perhaps Moshe's life, is in danger, and Tzipporah takes the flint or the rock and performs Brit Milah. It seems implicitly on their son or sons, and she makes this very curious comment, which she says, "Hatan damim atali," and you are my bridegroom or my husband of blood. And then there's this even stranger point right afterwards. So the next verse, it says, so it's "V'tikach tzipora tzor v'tichrot et orat b'na." So she cuts off the foreskin of her son. "V'tage'a l'raglav v'tomer ki hatan damim atali." And she threw it at his feet and said, "Surely you are a hatan, a bridegroom, or a husband of blood to me." And then it goes on, "V'yiref mimenu as amra hatan damim limuloth." So he let him go, and then she said, "A bridegroom of blood you are because of the circumcision." There's this elaboration. And it just described the performing of the circumcision, and it would seem that wouldn't be at all ambiguous. Like, what blood are we talking about here? Well, the circumcision was just performed. That must be it. But then there's this need the text has to kind of stop, and so the record skips, and we have to say, no, Chatan Dabim, yes, that's the thing we're talking about. Limulot, it's about the circumcision, just to be clear. And the question is, what is it clarifying? And I think you could make a larger thing out of this, and indeed, maybe it's worth another shiur sometime, because this pertains a lot, the point of Brit Milah, of the ritual circumcision and what it means. The main point I just want to make here is that what this underlines is that the nature of this marriage is being stated, that there's a connection being drawn very explicitly, so explicitly that it's not enough just to say Hatan Damim and not to talk about the Milah. It has to be, you say Hatan Damim Lamuloth. It's about the Milah. What is the Milah? The Milah is an ot, it's a sign that we give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, saying, we know that this child is from you and belongs to you, and that the point of this marriage is to bring up this child in Torah and mitzvot. And in a sense, the Brit Milah always contains this element of like a substitution for a sacrifice of the kind of Akedat Yitzchak, right? Where Avraham gets Yitzchak right after he performs Brit Milah on himself, and then he has to go through this act of showing HaKadosh Baruch Hu he still is willing to give Yitzchak back to him because he knows he's really from him. And it's all kind of rolled together. And what Brit Milah in general is about is saying, all right, Hashem doesn't want human sacrifice, but he does want you to say to him, this child, I know, is from you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And really, the reason we have it, the point of having the child is not for ourselves. The point of it is to create a person who will be an Oved Hashem and who will serve you according to your Torah. And so what this pasuk underlines that's so important here is that it's saying Zipporah's understanding of the basis of their marriage is that when she's saying to Moshe, you are my Hatan Damim Lemulov, meaning like there's an inseparability in a sense between the marriage between them and the blood of the Brit Milah for their son, because that's underlining that the whole point of this is Avodat Hashem, and that the marriage is not really about the husband and his desire for the wife, or the wife and her desire for her husband as the primary focus. It is not about their each being wholly and consumingly and idolatrously devoted to each other. Rather, it is about both of them being devoted to Hashem, and that their creation of a child together is an act of Avodat Hashem of supreme importance, and that has to be accomplished in the proper way and according to the Torah. So when we trace through these different sources, I think what we can summarize again, that if we go to the skeleton or the foundation of what marriage is understood to be, as far as the Torah is concerned, it is a way to sanctify a union between men and women that focuses on their ability to create children together, and the possibility that they desire children, especially the possibility that the woman desires to have children, as a way of turning the dynamic into something that can be sanctified, so that rather that everyone rolls down the slope into some or another form of znut, of prostitution, that instead there can be an agreement and a promise and a faithfulness on both sides that is about bringing children into the world together, and for those children to come into the world with a purpose that's oriented by Torah, and that keeps both parents ultimately devoted above all to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to what serving him requires of them as parents. And I don't think, in closing, that this means that there's no value or function to ahava in making marriages successful, and that's why the Torah mentions for many married couples that there was some ahava there, that Yaakov had great ahava for Rachel, for example, and there's no question that the sort of more delicate tissues of what you build on top of the bones or the skeleton is part of the living thing too, and that to make a very successful project together, in creating children together and in bringing them into the world and going through all the challenges of doing that together, and teaching them about Torah and about Hashem and all of that, that there's no question that those who are blessed in their marriages to have great ahava, kind of greasing the wheels or helping things to work, and be successful, maybe can be more successful because it's there. But it is a point worth making in this present era and in this present society, and then like in global kind of educated Western society, and also in Judaic society, that when we think about what are the minimal requirements or the sort of fundamental requirements of a successful marriage, we should not ultimately plant our feet in a notion of what marriage is about that is invented in Hollywood, or that was composed by medieval troubadours, or that was plucked out of Greek mythology, which in a sense fully separated the idea of marriage from the idea of love or attraction in its own way, and just expected everyone to be adulterers in order to pursue the latter sorts of desires. We have need to recognize and remember that what marriage is about fundamentally need not have anything to do with all of these notions that we have of the importance of ahava, or the importance of Hollywood love and its fulfillment, because it can definitely be the case that marriages can be less successful because people who enter into them they can both have a hard time starting, because people think they can't enter into them unless they're having a certain kind of poetic emotional experience at some exact moment. And it can also be that people have a hard time being committed to this project that they become a part of, if they're constantly asking themselves, on a minute by minute basis, like, how do I feel right now? And I need to be feeling like little birds are, lifting me up by my shoulders in a Disney movie, and if I don't, there must be something horribly wrong, and this isn't a marriage. I don't think that's what we're learning from our tradition. Is what marriage is fundamentally about, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't require, or often ahava as an ingredient. And again, it doesn't mean that it isn't better, in some cases, to have that. And many of us who have that, can say, Chasdei Hashem, we have that in our marriages, and it makes them successful. But it nonetheless is important to recognize that the fundamentals of this are about other things. And it's about, in a sense, a more sort of contractual plan to create new Avdei Hashem together. And different kinds of people can be party to such an arrangement. And it might be that you can have an arrangement that was very successful as far as what, let's say a woman wanted to have children and a man wanted to have children, and they both wanted their children to serve Hashem, and they both got to do that together, and they otherwise, I don't know, maybe enjoyed talking to their friends more or whatever. And that I think in the present day, such scenarios, when people imagine them, they're derided and dismissed a lot more, partly because of the impact of the Hollywood picture of things. But it is worth considering that that's not what we learned from our tradition. And so that means different kinds of people maybe should be able to or willing to consider different kinds of arrangements that could make sense, and that will help a greater diversity of Avdei Hashem find something, B'ezrat Hashem, that works for them in performing the tafkid that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has worked out for them.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.